Mana is the absolute foundation of the Mage class in Terraria, with every single magic weapon requiring it to be used. Without mana, the Mage class is nothing. Or is it? Well, with the help of a mod made by Wasefi that constantly sets my mana to 0, I set out to prove that a mage without mana isn't quite as powerless as you might think. The initial challenge of this playthrough is how on earth I'm going to get a magic weapon that doesn't use mana. My first thought was to get as much mana reduction as possible, as due to how Terraria's rounding works, I'd only need 51% to get the Wand of Sparking's 2 mana all the way down to 0. However, even with every single source of mana reduction in pre-hard mode, the maximum I could get while testing was 44%. And that's not even considering how I'd be able to get half of these items without dealing damage. For a while, it seemed like this challenge was over before it had even started. But then, the answer finally came to me, in a message from Yardis, who had done some testing of his own and came up with a solution to the early game that I never would have even considered. The first step in Yardis' plan was to fish up a Reaver Shark, as this has the pickaxe power necessary to break into the Forbidden Archives, a structure added by Calamity at the bottom of the dungeon. Here, the Dungeon Guardian replaces my skull a few dozen times, but eventually I manage to Dormammu my way to the chests in the centre where I secure myself a shadow key. With this I head down to the Underworld and start opening shadow chests. The main thing I'm looking for here is meteor bars. In vanilla, meteor armour makes the space gun and both sapinators completely free to use. However, Calamity changes this set bonus to instead provide 67% mana reduction for any magic guns. Initially I dismissed this for the early game since the only pre-boss magic gun is the space gun, which with a base mana cost of 6 is still too high to be reduced down to 0. And that's where Yardis would end up saving this run, because instead of just looking at the pre-boss options, he thought of something a little more out of the box. It turns out that there is a single pre-hard mode magic gun that can be reduced down to 0 mana, the Bee Gun. You may then be wondering how I'm going to take down Queen Bee without dealing any damage to her. Well, that's the neat part, I don't have to. Queen Bee is unique among the other bosses in the game as she's the only one that's canonically my friend. At least if you believe that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. What I mean by this is that as long as there are other bees alive, Queen Bee will deal damage to and take damage from any other enemy she comes into contact with. This is very easy to take advantage of with a line of statues placed along the wire from a dart trap. Each time Queen Bee dashes, she'll trade blows with the mob spawned by the statues, with the one drawback being that I also get caught in the crossfire. Because of this setup, I don't really have to worry about mobility or damage, so I can focus entirely on defense by crafting and decrafting yo-yo strings to get warding on them, along with an obsidian skull which goes through the same process. Without being able to farm drops from mobs, this seemed like the best set of survivability accessories I could get. Not being able to damage mobs also meant I couldn't take down hornets for the stinger used in the recipe for the Abeemination, so instead I found these in one of the beehive planetoids, which I wasn't even aware was possible until this run. These more defensive accessories let me outlive Queen Bee on the next attempt, but unfortunately I don't get a bee gun from the treasure bag, so I defeat her again and luckily this time I do get one, but I can't celebrate just yet. You see, the one thing I didn't mention about Yardis' plan is that it only works if I get a bee gun with the right modifier, and there's only 3 potential options for this: Mystic, Adept, and Masterful. Each of these provide 15% mana reduction. However, due to how rounding works on modifiers, this ends up actually reducing the bee gun's 4 mana cost down to 3, which the meteor armour is then just powerful enough to bring to 0. With a 1 in 36 chance of getting a bee gun with one of those modifiers though, I was going to need to take down a lot of Queen Bees. One hour and 48 Queen Bees later, I open one of my many treasure bags to find a masterful bee gun within it, finally giving me my first usable weapon of the playthrough a mere 7.5 hours into it. Thankfully, this weapon is a lot more than just usable though, with it tearing through the entirety of pre-hard mode over the next couple of hours. The only situations where it struggles is against enemies with high defense or resistance to piercing projectiles like worm bosses. Against single targets however, it truly excels, and carries me all the way to hard mode in no time. Even within hard mode, the bee gun remains somewhat viable against normal enemies. However, with the higher defensive hard mode bosses, I'll need to make an upgrade, which I thankfully don't have to look far for. After getting a few early hard mode upgrades like fairy wings and boots, a giant tortoise shell and the amalgamated brain, I returned to fighting the wall of flesh for the laser rifle. Much like the bee gun, this has a base mana cost of 4, at least in Calamity, and now that I have the Goblin Tinkerer for reforges, I won't just have to repeatedly roll the dice by farming the wall like I did with Queen Bee. Don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of luck involved due to Calamity's reforge rework, since items now always get a higher value modifier and Mythical is seen as the best for magic weapons despite having a lower mana reduction. I'm lucky enough to get Mystic on my very first laser rifle, and while Masterful would give slightly higher damage, I decide not to risk making this one unusable in order to get it. I do continue fighting the wall a few times to try and get Masterful, but each time I get a laser rifle it gets stuck in the Mythical loop, which feels like a bit of a flaw in Calamity's reforge system. Either way, my Mystic laser rifle is still more than capable of taking down the twins, which unlocks tier 2 hard mode ores and with them, my third potential weapon in the form of the SHPC. If you only looked at the tooltip, this weapon's base mana cost of 20 would seem unusably high, but it actually has an entirely separate right-click function that only costs 6 mana. I do still need to use some mana reduction accessories such as the Arcane Flower and Mana Cloak to make it work though, and since the damage output is very similar to the laser rifle, I mainly just stick to using that. Those 4 accessory slots are worth so much more than a slightly better weapon. Considering just how important mana reduction accessories are going to be in this run, the next boss I take on is Cryogen. Now while he may not drop anything useful himself, he does unlock the Archmage who sells me the Permafrost Concoction, an accessory that grants 15% mana reduction, some extra regen while at low health, and a revive with a 3-minute cooldown. This is probably a good point to bring up the rather confusing nature of mana reduction. You'd think the 15% from Permafrost's Concoction would be more powerful than the 8% from the Mana Flower, but that's not always the case. From my own testing, it appears that most of the mana reduction boosts from Calamity accessories are multiplicative rather than additive like the ones in vanilla. Calamity armors seem to remain additive, except for the magic gun reduction from Meteor armor, which appears to be entirely separate from anything else. This becomes even less intuitive when you look at items from vanilla that Calamity makes changes to, like the butterfly wings, which Calamity gives 5% mana reduction. Despite being multiplicative, this still makes them the preferred wing of choice for the rest of hard mode. In short, you really can't take any of these numbers at face value, and the further we get into the playthrough, the more testing and swapping will be required to get the right level of mana reduction, especially once Meteor armor is no longer viable. Thankfully though, for now it still is, and with all the mechs defeated, there's actually another couple magic guns I can test. The Gauss pistol DPS is really good, however it's incredibly hard to aim since the projectile stays still for a few seconds upon being fired, along with needing 3 mana reduction accessories to work. The Ion Blaster, despite being listed on the wiki as having a mana cost of 6, actually costs 10 mana in game, which at this point is too expensive to be usable even if I had an entire loadout dedicated to mana reduction. Basically, the testing came back negative, and the laser rifle remains my best weapon for at least a little longer. It may have served me well up to this point, but the cracks are definitely starting to show, with it taking over 6 minutes to take down Plantera. Luckily there's hope on the horizon though, as from Plantera's treasure bag I obtain a Leaf Blower, a magic gun with a mana cost of 5. With the right reforge I can use this with only 2 mana reduction accessories, finally giving me a definitive upgrade to the laser rifle. Well, not quite, as it turns out the laser rifle is still better against groups of enemies or bosses with multiple segments thanks to its ability to pierce, along with it being much easier to use against anything too fast or small for the Leaf Blower to hit, which means it's still somehow the weapon of choice against the Calamitas clone, although it's not as if that gives me any upgrades. For that, I'll need to take down either Astrum Aureus or Golem, and after quite a few failed attempts against Aureus, I decide to circle back to this later and move on to Golem. Eventually, after a 7.5 minute fight, I managed to take down Golem, granting me the Picksaw and therefore allowing me to mine Scoria ore in the Abyss. Other than the Sigil of Calamitas acting as some mana reduction with a damage boost attached, and a Miracle Fruit for some extra health, this doesn't really give me much though. My main reason for defeating Golem was to get access to the Martian invasion, I had nowhere near the strength needed to take down any saucers, but I could chip away at Martian walkers for the wingman, another magic gun with a mana cost of 5. For whatever reason though, I couldn't get this to work even when it cost 0 mana, so I remained rather stuck with no easy way forward. I couldn't beat Old Duke for the bubble gun, I couldn't beat a Martian saucer for the laser machine gun, I couldn't even beat Astrum Aureus for the extra mana reduction from Starbeam Rai, which would have at least allowed me to use the leaf blower with one less accessory slot. It seemed my strategy of sticking with magic guns and meteor armour wasn't working, so it was time to look a little further afield. And after searching through every single magic weapon in the game and making note of their mana costs, I think I may have found the perfect one to get me out of this rut. Actually obtaining the thing was another story though, as it drops from Ever Screams during the Frost Moon event. If you weren't already aware, the drop rates of items in this event scale with how many waves you've defeated, and with me barely being able to make it to wave 10 out of 20 by morning, there was somewhere around a diddly squat % chance of me getting it on any given Frost Moon. Still, at least I can actually take this enemy down, which on its own is enough to make it my best path forward even with the abysmal drop rates. It takes many Ever Screams, but finally I get what I was looking for, the Razor Pine. Since this isn't a magic gun, meteor armour is of no use in reducing its 5 base mana cost. Instead I buy Dark Artist robes from the Tavern Keep using some defender medals I accumulated before taking on Golem. Aside from granting more defense than the entire meteor armour set, my main reason for using this is the 15% mana reduction it gives, the highest of any chest piece in the game. For my helmet, the best option is Chlorophyte, as its 17% mana reduction is the highest currently available. Sadly, there's no leg armour that provides mana reduction, so I go with Mollusk Shell-leggings for the highest damage instead. On top of this very specific combination of armour, I also need to use 4 accessories devoted to mana reduction along with specifically butterfly wings to use the Razor Pine, leaving only one extra slot which I fill with the Asgard's Valour for its ram dash and knockback immunity. This lack of accessory slots really doesn't get me down though, as my damage output is a great deal higher than before. This power boost ends up being exactly what I need to take down Astrum Aureus on the very next attempt. From the treasure bag I obtain the Aureus cells needed to make Starbeam Rai, an alcohol buff that grants 10% mana reduction, 50 extra mana, and 8% magic damage at the cost of some defense and life regen. This remains useful for the rest of the game, but will mostly be reserved for boss fights to avoid having to farm too much of it. Speaking of farming, I return to the Martian invasion in the hopes of grinding through some saucers for the laser machine gun. While doing so however, another wingman drops, and out of curiosity I decide to try using it despite it not working previously. To my absolute surprise, it actually ends up working. I'm not sure why, but it seems this weapon specifically doesn't work if the meteor armor set bonus brings it down to 0 mana, but it does work if the mana reduction comes from other sources. Confusion aside, the wingman is a very strong weapon with around the same damage as my Razor Pine but having a much longer range and the ability to pierce. With it, I continue fighting the Martians and take down a few saucers until I get the laser machine gun, which ends up being a little underwhelming by comparison. For my next weapon, I could take down either Duke Fishron or the Plaguebringer Goliath, and after switching between the two for a while, I eventually settle on PBG, not because it's an easier fight, but because I'm more curious about the weapon it would unlock. The fight is likely much harder in fact, to the point that I have to employ a new strategy to the channel of using multiple loadouts during a boss fight. My primary one is mostly devoted to mana reduction so I'm able to actually deal damage. Then whenever I get low on health I hot swap to a secondary loadout based on defense and survivability until I regain some of my lost health. Part of this involved a small intermission to take down Ravager for the Blood Pact, but other than this I mainly just farmed potions and died to PBG for a few hours until I eventually broke through. With the Goliath defeated I used some of the plating it drops to craft a Gatling laser, yet another magic gun that costs only 4 mana. It takes a little bit of time decrafting, crafting and reforging until I finally get one with the right modifier, but once I do the power boost is very noticeable, with me taking down Duke on my very next attempt. What's more, the fight was over so quickly that I even ended up no-hitting him according to boss checklist. Although my dodge did activate twice, so this wouldn't be valid under official no-hit rules. For whatever reason, I end up getting not one but two bubble guns from the treasure bag, one of which already has Masterful on it. I take the other one and reforge it to Mythical, which it turns out gives the same mana reduction for this weapon due to rounding. At a close enough range or against a big enough enemy, this is about twice as strong as my Gatling laser while costing only one extra accessory slot to use. I much prefer the longer range and ease of use of the Gatling laser though, so push forward with it to fight the cultist. I should clarify that while I could use this with only a set of meteor armor and no mana reduction accessories, I've actually opted to stick with my mixed mana reduction armor and 3 mana reduction accessories, since it provides better stats while still allowing me to use Wings, the Asgard's Valor, and the Amalgamated Brain, which is all the mobility and utility I need for this fight. With the pillars comes 2 new weapons to try out. First is the Nano Purge crafted from nanites, vortex fragments, and the laser machine gun. This deals excellent damage, however at a base mana cost of 8, it requires an entire loadout devoted to mana reduction in order to use it. Admittedly, one of these mana reduction accessories also happens to be Wings, but overall the cost is a bit too high to make it worth using. The second weapon requires taking down Golem another few times to get the Heat Ray, which then gets combined with the Space Gun and some solar fragments to craft the Lazar. This both operates and performs almost exactly the same as the Gatling laser, even having the same mana cost of 4. The main difference separating the two is that the Gatling laser starts out slightly stronger at full charge, but becomes slightly weaker as its charge decreases. Against most bosses, these would probably end up with incredibly similar kill times, but by using both you can get a slight edge, and in this playthrough, even a slight edge may make quite a difference considering these are the last weapons I'll get until post-Providence. Thankfully, they perform very well against the Moonlord, and despite me dying a couple of times due to the butterfly wings not being quite fast enough to dodge the death laser, I eventually start anticipating the attack a little earlier and come out on top. Normally, this stage of the game provides many opportunities for upgrades, almost like a hard mode version 2. For me though, there's really only one, and it comes from a very unexpected place. Crafted from 25 Exodium clusters, 25 Navy Plate, and 5 Necroplasm, the Eldritch Soul artifact is widely regarded as one of the worst accessories in Calamity. This mainly comes down to the fact that its varied buffs almost seem to be fighting against each other. You can't really use stealth regen and melee speed at the same time after all. Despite that, it ends up being one of the best accessories in this playthrough thanks to its impressive 25% mana reduction. Other than a pair of solar wings, that's really it in terms of post-Moonlord upgrades, so all I can do is carry on to the Profaned Guardians and Providence. While my damage may be quite low for this stage of the game, the Guardians really aren't too much trouble, and are defeated in a 4-minute fight which felt like 40. Providence is a little harder, in the end taking 5 separate attempts and an eventual 7-minute fight to defeat her, which really isn't too bad considering my loadout and weapons. After mining a bunch of Honeybloom, I go through the whole craft, reforge and decraft loop to get a plasma caster with the right reforge. Turns out this was a waste of time though, since the accuracy on this thing is absolutely awful. The much more accurate yet slower firing left click attack is off limits as well, since it costs 3 times as much mana as the right click does. Thankfully though, there's another, much better option that's also now available. The Biofusillade is the very first spell tome of this playthrough, and has a very fast fire rate, perfect accuracy, and even pierces once, all for the low cost of 4 base mana. Alongside this I craft the Tarragon Mask, which has 2% less mana reduction than the Chlorophyte headgear, but otherwise provides much better stats. The Tarragon leggings replace my Mollusk ones, providing the same effective damage but much higher defense and speed. Then out of curiosity I take off my Dark Artist's robes to test if I could still use the Biofusillade. Turns out this is just barely possible with 4 mana reduction accessories as opposed to 3 with the robes. With that in mind, my next goal is taking down Providence again for enough Divine Geodes to complete my Tarragon armor set, which I may as well do in the Underworld to get the Elysian Aegis. This is so much faster than the first fight, taking just 2 minutes and 44 seconds compared to the previous 7 minutes. Once it's done and after a little more mining for Honeybloom, I finally have a full armor set once again, even complete with wings which provide defense and regen when worn with the armor set. Overall, this is the best position I've been in for both damage and survivability since obtaining my very first usable B-gun in pre-hard mode. But no amount of equipment can make up for a lack of skill, so I die quite a few times to Ceaseless Void before taking a break to fight Dragon Folly. Whether it was the break, the rage upgrade from Dragon Folly, or just sheer luck, I take down Ceaseless Void a couple attempts later and use the Dark Plasma he dropped to craft the Missile Storm, which has very high single target damage but less range and more inaccuracy than the Biofusillade. The main downside though is that despite costing only 1 extra mana, I need to either give up my armor set and use the Dark Artist robes again, or give up 2 more accessory slots for the mana reduction needed to use it. I decide to stick with the Biofusillade for now and move on to the Stormweaver, Cygnus, and Poltergast. With Poltergast down, I gather up some Blood Orbs and Bloodstone to craft a set of Bloodflare armour, which is more of a side grade to Tarragon than an upgrade, with each of them having their own pros and cons. The Bloodflare hood provides a slightly higher 17% mana reduction than the Tarragon's 15, but this isn't enough to make any difference for the weapons I'm currently using. My next challenge is the Devourer of Gods. And by that I mean my next challenge is building a large enough arena and collecting enough potions for the Devourer of Gods. Up until now I've really just skipped over this ever-present part of the game since it doesn't make for particularly good watching, but when you suddenly go from a few attempts per boss to a few dozen attempts per boss, you really start to notice it a lot more. Throughout these attempts I switched between the Biofusillade and Missile Storm many times, but one thing I learned very early on regardless of which weapon I used was to always aim for the head. With other weapons you can get away with body shots provided you hit many segments at a time, but considering my weapons pierce either one time or none time, that's not really an option. Fighting the Devourer in this way is definitely a little different than what I'm used to, with me having to lead him in certain ways to line myself up with his head for maximum damage. In the end though I'm glad for the experience, since it's another strategy I have in my arsenal for future runs. Next up is the usual grind through the moon events that I'm sure you've all seen 100 times by now. As boring as this may be, it does unlock quite a few upgrades like the Asgardian Aegis, the Sponge, and Silva Armour, which includes a higher mana reduction headpiece for the first time since Chlorophyte. Don't get too excited though, it's just 19% compared to 17. Much more important is the revive granted by the Silva Armour set bonus, which the Silva Wings go on to buff even more. There's also 2 new weapons to test out at this stage, first of which is the Light God's Brilliance. With a base mana cost of 6, this needs 5 mana reduction accessories to bring it down to 0 mana, leaving room for only my Wings and Asgardian Aegis. This wouldn't be so bad if I could use it with the full Silva Armour set, but sadly I also need the mana reduction from the Dark Artist robes. I must say the damage output is incredibly high though, so even with its drawbacks it's still very tempting to use. The second new weapon is an upgrade to the Wingman called the Omicron. This magic gun has a mana cost of 8, so even with the Meteor Armour I still need to use 4 accessories dedicated to mana reduction. While this is 1 accessory less than the Light God's Brilliance, it's incredibly hard to justify the use of Meteor Armour at this stage of the game. The very unique pros and mostly cons of each weapon makes Yaren quite the obstacle to overcome. The Biofusillade is by far the cheapest to use, letting me wear full Silva Armour with only 4 accessories for mana reduction. Its damage output however is also by far the lowest, and it would take me over 8 minutes to defeat Yaren with it. The Omicron with Meteor Armour deals more damage at the same accessory cost, but the dreadful armour stats destroy my survivability. The Light God's Brilliance deals the most damage by far, costs 1 more accessory slot than the previous 2, and lands somewhere in the middle when it comes to armour, lacking the set bonus that the Biofusillade enjoys but granting much better stats than the Meteor Armour. There's simply no right answer for which weapon is the best to use. and after making very little progress with any of them, I decide to revive my Plaguebringer strategy by having one loadout built for damage and one for survivability. I'll spare you the details of me farming for all the duplicate armour and accessories I need, as it was quite the grind, but at least the Light God's brilliance made refighting bosses significantly faster. Since this has the highest damage output and my survivability is now relegated to a secondary loadout, this becomes the obvious choice for Yaren despite its high mana reduction cost. This does mean that at any point I'm only a couple hits from death, so if I fail to switch my loadout quick enough or get a little too cocky, then that's another attempt down the drain. In general, it's best for me to switch to my survivability loadout as soon as I take a single hit. Then once I've regenerated to full health, I can switch back to my damage loadout for the 5 seconds it takes me to get hit again and repeat the cycle. Over time I started getting better at this whole dodge and damage then swap and survive technique, and I'm soon getting very close to defeating him, but each time his health gets low I choke and die, until eventually I manage to take him down for good. With Yaren defeated, I can start mining up Auric ore to make my final upgrades for the last 2 bosses of the game, starting with Auric Tesla armour. Despite granting only 1% more mana reduction than Silva, the helmet is just strong enough for me to use the Light God's brilliance with just 4 mana reduction accessories as opposed to the previous 5, at least while I have the Starbeam Rai buff active. That amount of precise mana reduction may not be necessary though, as there's once again a new weapon I can try out, the Aetherflux Cannon. Coming in at a base cost of 7 mana, it requires just 3 mana reduction accessories while using Meteor Armour, or 5 accessories with my mixed mana reduction set. Even this late into the game, this technically pre-boss vanilla armour set is still somehow a viable option. For my damage loadout, this is really the best gear I can get, but I do grab a Radiance and Rampart of Deities for my survivability loadout before trying to decide which of the final 2 bosses I'll fight first. I figured that since I usually find Supreme Calamitas easier, I may as well start with her. This, it later turned out, was an awful decision. These attempts really made me realise just how much I rely on accessories like the Sponge, Amalgam, Nebulous Core and Radiance during this fight to allow me to take hits and quickly recover. I can still use a couple of these on my damage based loadout, but with a puny 65 defense that makes some pre-hard mode loadouts look tanky, it doesn't help much. Throughout this I've been continuing to use my survivability loadout for the bullet hell phases, and eventually I decide to take this concept even further with the addition of a third loadout specifically designed for the Brimstone Hearts phase, which up to this point has been a major time sink in each attempt. To do this I first have to fight Yaren a few more times to get Yaren's Crystal, which is one of the best multi-target magic weapons in the entire game. With a base mana cost of 10 however, it requires that pretty much my entire loadout is geared towards mana reduction and leaves space for only my wings. Considering just how much faster it is at getting through the Brimstone Heart phase however, it's well worth the risky loadout. If I line myself up correctly, this can tear through the hearts in just a few seconds, much less than the 30 or more it would sometimes take with my other weapons. Over the next few dozen attempts with this strategy, I do get close on some occasions, but sadly never quite close enough. After many failed attempts, I decide to switch things up and give the Exomechs a try instead. Immediately, this felt a whole lot better than Escal. By my 15th attempt I was already in the final phase of the final mech. Don't get me wrong, it still only takes a couple of slip-ups in quick succession to end an attempt, but I think the fact that I've struggled more with this boss in the past actually means I know the fight a lot better at this stage. I've simply practiced it a lot more. At first glance, this is a much more chaotic fight than Escal is, but once I learned how the fight works it became a lot more predictable, and dare I say robotic. It's almost more of a knowledge check than a skill check, which is quite thematically fitting with the lore surrounding Draydon and his inhuman pursuit of knowledge. In the end it only takes 27 attempts to take down the Exomechs, with the final fight coming in at just under 5.5 minutes. In terms of drops, the exomechs have no magic weapons, and the two crafted from miracle matter cost way too much mana to ever be reduced to 0. That doesn't mean I don't gain anything from this fight though, as the exo tier mount boasts incredibly fast and precise mobility, allowing me to take off both my wings and dash. This opens up 2 new slots for accessories, which I fill with Draydon's Heart and the Rampart of Deities, which when combined with the Amalgam and the Sponge provide a massive boost to my survivability. Even while wearing Meteor Armour and 3 mana reduction accessories, I still managed to fairly easily survive an 8-minute encounter with Supreme Calamitas, which I now feel the need to clarify is not a euphemism. So yes, you can beat Calamity as a mage with no mana, but why just beat something when you can destroy it? To do that, I craft some Shadow Spec bars and combine them with some other magic weapons to make the Dance of Light, a developer spell tome that costs 6 mana and blows every other weapon I've used out of the water. While I use this to bully the exomechs in Escal again, I'd like to thank some of the people that made this video possible. First of all, Wasefi for making the mod this playthrough is built upon. Secondly, Yardis for his help in routing the early game up to my first weapon, and last but not least, all of my wonderful patrons. As always, your support is very much appreciated and allows me to turn down all the shady sponsors that reach out to me. Now while it's not quite possible to beat vanilla Terraria as a mage with 0 mana, it is possible to beat it with 1, which is exactly what Thorbin did in this video here that I highly recommend you check out next.